One of the more popular ways that you hear of this is a very well-known movie that was put out on the internet called Zeitgeist. How many of you have heard of Zeitgeist? Seen the same clips of it? You go on YouTube and Google this. And in the very beginning of it, you'll hear something along this lines. This is what the narrator says. Furthermore, the character of Jesus, a literary and astrological hybrid, is most explicitly a plagiarization of the Egyptian sun god Horus. For example, inscribed about 3,500 years ago on the walls of the Temple of Luxor in Egypt are images of the Annunciation, the Immaculate Conception, the birth, and the adoration of Horus. The images begin with Thaw, announcing the Virgin Isis that she will conceive Horus. Then Neph, the Holy Ghost, impregnating the Virgin. And then the Virgin birth and the adoration. This is exactly the story of Jesus' miracle conception. In fact, the literary similarities between Jesus and the Egyptian religion are staggering. And if you remember a few years ago, even the book, The Da Vinci Code, right, the scholar Teabing claims nothing in Christianity is original. So we see these claims showing up all the time, that there's these messiahs who were born on December 25th of a virgin or accompanied by a star. They had 12 disciples. They did miracles. They were crucified. They were buried. They were resurrected after 3 days. The Jesus myth is just one more in a much longer history of myths. Is this all true? The idea that the Jew would grab onto any of these ancient myths and incorporate them into the Jewish faith is to me, absurd. It just doesn't make sense. But even so, like I said, what's the actual myth that we're talking about? Let's not take their word for it. Let's go look into the source material. You notice that none of these guys are saying, this scholar here said X, and if you compare X to Y, right? Anybody, have you ever said, oh, you got to meet this guy, he looks exactly like you. I remember as a kid, I had a lady tell me this all the time. Oh, you got to meet my grandson. He looks exactly like you. He looks like, oh, really? Wow, I got a twin. I got a doppelganger walking around. And then I met him, and I'm like, no, he doesn't. And if he does, I need to talk to my mother. But sometimes when you actually study the facts, it's not quite as similar as you may think. Let's start off with the Horus and Osiris myth. This is ancient Egypt. And I'm going to give you a description taken from the Fetish to God in Ancient Egypt. This is published by Budge. He was the author on Benjamin Bloom, 1972. So this is like a standard reference work on Egyptian myth, okay? And here's what we hear about the Horus. Now, Horus and Osiris, the reason why I'm combining them is because they're kind of mixed together. As far as people understand it, Horus is actually the son of Osiris. Osiris and Isis were husband and wife kind of thing. And Horus becomes the son, but Horus also raises himself up to become the you'll recognize Horus. He's the guy that has the falcon head and the human body and all the pyramid drawings that you see. Okay, he becomes the dominant player as Egyptian mythology develops. Osiris and Isis were prior to that, but here's how Horus works. And again, the myths start to get intermingled. And most of the dying and rising kind of stuff actually is pointing towards Osiris, not Horus. Osiris was born on the first of 5 epochamenal days of the year. In other words, there was a start to the Egyptian calendar. And Osiris was born during that first of those 5 days when the sun dips down. It's not December 25th by any. It would be closer in our calendar if we were looking at it to maybe December 28th or something like that. Now, he married his sister Isis and ruled in the lower kingdom. He was tricked by his evil brother Set into lying into a coffin, and they nailed the coffin shut, and Set cast it into the Nile, which drowned Osiris. The coffin floats around, comes to rest in a tamarisk tree. The tree grows up around the coffin. And Isis, in the meantime, doesn't know any of this is happening. She's mourning. She goes to find her husband. A king of Egypt had, in the meantime, cut down the tree and used the big trunk as a pillar in his palace. Isis then takes on a guise, finding the trunk of the tree, wanting Osiris there, becomes a nursemaid to one of the king's children, and she gives the child a finger to suck, but she burns away the mortal portions of his body every night by fire. Then she takes the form of a swallow, and when the queen sees all this, that the child is in the fire and the swallow, she's all horrified, and she pulls the child out, but the child no longer becomes immortal. So the idea of Isis providing immortality to this child, he's actually robbed of that immortality. Isis says, I was just doing this in order to get this tree trunk because my husband's in there in a coffin. Fine, the king says, take your tree trunk, take your pillar and go. Set, though, doesn't like the idea of Osiris coming and trouncing him again. So Set raids the coffin, tears Osiris into 14 pieces and scatters him throughout the entire Nile Delta. Isis, being the diligent wife she is, goes and picks up the pieces of Osiris. She's going to put them back together again. See? She has the technology. We can do this. Unfortunately, she finds only 13 of the 14 pieces. Anybody guess which one's missing? The most important one for family is missing. It was fed to a catfish. Isis then makes a model of a golden phallus and conceives Horus through it. So this is the virgin birth part of the story. Is that so? Osiris returns to the earth. He encourages Horus to fight Set, but because he's not a full man, he becomes god of the underworld. He never again returns to his previous splendor. So what do we have here? We have an Egyptian myth where a god, I should say, Horus, is died, torn into 14 pieces, having 13 pieces put back together, and now becomes Lord of the Underworld. Does this sound like a resurrection to you? But this is the actual myth. Does Horus being conceived through Isis' trickery and creating a golden phallus, does that sound like a virgin birth? Is this similar at all to the story in Luke chapter 2? Or, are these really parallel accounts? Really? What does Luke say? Right? He says, when Caesar Augustus ordered a census of all nations in the town of Bethlehem, he names names. He points out places. He says what years happened. When did all of this happen? Well, sometime in the mystical past. Children are burned in fire to cleanse them of their mortality and become... This, Horus and Osiris, this all smacks of myth. Everything about the tale feels fabricated. There are no real names, places, right? As opposed to what we have in things like Luke 2. The other problem that we have is one I mentioned before, that there's multiple myths. And what I've given you is kind of the most common understanding of the situation. But under EgyptianMyths.net, they write this. Attempts to resolve the conflicts between the different gods in the different parts of Egypt resulted in at least 15 distinct forms of Horus. They can be divided fairly easily into two main groups, the solar and the Osirian, based on the parentage of the particular form of Horus that we're talking about. So we're not even sure who Horus' parents are, because it depends on which type of myth you choose. If he's said to be the son of Isis, he is Osirian. Otherwise, he's a solar deity. The solar Horus was called the son of Atum, or Ra, or Geb, or Nut, variously. So you see the problem that we have here. When we start comparing apples to apples, do you really think Jewish first century writers are hearing this Horus tale and saying, that's what we need in our gospel? I just don't see the parallel at all. I just don't see anything that draws that kind of comparison. Now, is this death or resurrection account? Do you guys consider this? When you say resurrection, isn't the resurrected body at least as good as what it was before? Right? Jairus' daughter. Your daughter is made well. Boom. Well, Lazarus, we don't hear of him missing an arm or something, right? He comes back home. Jesus' resurrection, he's given the same body, but with a new nature to it. It has new attributes in his body, but it is the same body, and he proves it by saying, see the holes in my hand, right? Thomas, put your finger in my side. It is me. It is flesh and bone. Spirits do not have flesh and bone. He eats with them. That's one of the reasons why he eats with them in the Sea of Galilee in the morning, is to show them, hey, spirits don't have flesh and bone like I do. The whole Osiris thing is more B-grade zombie movie. I mean, if you're really looking at it, he's the zombie. He's now the kind of the ruler of the underworld.